Well, we're attending a conference that you're speaking at. What is the conference and what's it about?
It's the Association of Israel Studies, so it's essentially scholars who work in anything related to Israel studies, history, economics, politics, international relations, literature, film, culture, pretty widespread of subjects.
Where are they from?
Most of them are from the United States, particularly out here on the West Coast. It's 1 year in Israel, 1 year in the United States. So it was in Brandeis 2 years ago, it was in Haifa last year, this year here, next year Ben Gurion.
And how many Israeli academics come to it?
Well, a lot more when it's in Israel. So,
but even here you have...
Here there are plenty of Israelis, lots of Hebrew being spoken, not at the talks, but...
and what will your talk today be about?
So we have a panel that's on the cognitive disorientation of the West. And the theme is that on the one hand, the West is literally incapable of processing information for a variety of reasons, psychological, cognitive, political correctness, and so on. And the ways in which Israel in particular, and a misunderstanding of Israel and the Arab-Israeli conflict plays into a larger inability to deal with some of the major issues of our day, you know, Islamism, global jihad.
When you say inability or unwillingness?
Well, you know, for some people it's unwillingness, for other people it's inability. I distinguish between what I call demopaths and dupes. Demopaths are people who use the language of human rights, civil rights, democracy, equality, not because they believe in it or have any intention of allowing other people to enjoy those rights, but because it's a way of paralyzing the people who do believe in it. So on the one hand, you have demopaths, and that's an organization like CARE. A lot, for instance, there was just recently an article in the Chronicle of Higher Education about how academia is not interested in specialists on jihad and terrorism. And one of the commentators, who was a Muslim, who's the head of Middle East Studies at a major college, at a major university, said, well, you know, we don't really want those people because we're really laboring hard to dissipate the notion that the Middle East is somehow a particular matrix of this kind of thinking, which is a bizarre thing, but it's an agenda, and it's an agenda for people who in fact come from these areas and participate in this kind of radical thinking, and they're the demopaths, and they're saying, you know, you shouldn't be stereotyping us. And then there are the dupes who say, oh yeah, well, we don't want to be racist. Not even we don't want to be racist, we don't want to be called racist. I mean, it's ludicrous. Islam is not a racial phenomenon. So the idea that to criticize Islam is somehow racist, or Islamism in particular is somehow racist, is a ludicrous use of the word racist, but what can you do?
To what extent do you feel that the issues of media bias and distortion vis-a-vis the Israel-Palestine conflict have been recognized publicly?
Well, it depends. I mean, there's, you know, amongst people who support Israel, there's a widespread perception that there's a really serious skew in journalism. The very fact that you use the term Israel-Palestine conflict rather than Israeli-Arab conflict reflects a sort of cognitive victory in which the, you know, the framing has it that the Palestinians are this tiny group who are being oppressed. So Israel's the Goliath and the Palestinians are David. But anybody who knows what the word intifada comes from, it comes from an animal that shrugs off a fly, knows that they consider Israel to be the fly and they're shrugging it off. So they view themselves as part of a much larger 350 million Arabs, 1 point whatever billion Muslims, and this tiny Israel. And part of the real serious problem in the conflict is that for Arabs and for Muslims, the idea that this tiny group of people who used to be dhimmi, who used to be subject people, are now independent is a scandalous. It's a theological blasphemy. It's a blight on Arab honor that the Jews would have declared their independence in the heart of the Arab world, in the heart of Dar al-Islam. That's one of the main sources of the problem. So when you define it as the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, you literally don't know what you're talking about.
Now, I'm familiar with the subject, but the reason that I characterize it that way is because it was the Palestinian Pallywood,
right?
Not outside of Israel, but specifically a Palestinian staging,
right?
But
this goes on all over the place. In other words, when Israel was in Lebanon, Hezbollah was doing the same thing. At Kafar Khana, there were all these, so it's also known as Hizbollywood, it's known as photography. It happened to the United States in Afghanistan and in Iraq. And for instance, the rumor, which was spread as news by our journalists, Time Magazine and so on, that the Americans were flushing Qurans down the toilet at Guantanamo Bay caused huge riots. A lot of people died. Totally false story. So I call this lethal journalism. Part of it is you have to understand this as part of a cognitive war. In an asymmetrical war, and there's no greater asymmetrical war than the war between the Palestinians and between Islamism, jihad, and the West. In an asymmetrical war, the weak side can't win on the battlefield. Its main efforts are in the cognitive field. That's where they need to win, certainly during the opening stages of the fight. And one of the major weapons that they use in cognitive war is what Nedra Polar calls a lethal narrative. And a lethal narrative is a story that's intended to create three things. One, a desire, a feeling of hatred and a desire for revenge on your side. You're the ones who are being deliberately murdered, your children are being deliberately murdered, and so on. A real loathing for your enemy on the part of outsiders who look at this and say, oh my gosh, look at what they're doing to their kids. And a kind of paralyzing sense of guilt amongst your enemy. So lethal narratives, Muhammad Abdullah is the sort of ultimate in lethal narratives. I call it the nuclear bomb of cognitive warfare. And the real danger is, on the one hand, yes, the weak side is going to make up whatever stories it wants. The real danger is when a sort of outside independent media reports it as news. It was interesting, a number of Russians noted that when the Russians sent Sputnik into the sky, the Russians didn't believe Pravda when it said we've launched a satellite. They only believed it when it came from the Americans. And I think that the role of the Western media in reporting this stuff has played a very significant role in sort of, in a sense, Western journalism has become the delivery system for lethal narratives.
To what extent do you believe that Western reporting on the Arab-Israeli conflict should be believed on its face, even by Robert Berger, Jerusalem, CBS News, Martin Fletcher, NBC News, not to mention the Arab reporters who are working for AP and Reuters?
Personally, I think it's radically, shall we say, we should be applying a hermeneutic of suspicion to anything that we hear. These reporters are under heavy pressure to report favorably to the Palestinians. There was a lynching in Ramallah shortly after the Al-Dura affair, in which they were screaming revenge for the blood of Muhammad Al-Dura. They tore these two reservists who came to Ramallah by accident into pieces and dragged them through the streets. And the Palestinians, of course, tried to round up everybody and eliminate the material, but one Italian crew brought some out. And another Italian crew sent a letter to Arafat saying, we would never do this, trying to avoid retaliation. It's not us, it's this other Italian group. We would never do this because we always follow the rules of coverage in the Palestinian territories. And the rules are, you don't say anything negative about the Palestinians, you know, and you report their lethal narratives about the Israelis as news. And so I would say, by and large, the news we get is certainly BBC. I track BBC and CNN, and the degree to which that is sort of obsessively reporting anything negative about Israel, even when it's totally false. Like in the last operation, there were 2 major stories about these children who were killed, and it turns out they were killed by Hamas rockets that fell short. But that gets reported as Israel killing the kids. There was one BBC reporter who actually retweeted a picture of a Syrian baby who was killed in Syria as if it had happened in Gaza.
Now, certainly there's intimidation
Yeah.
of the reporters on the ground.
Right.
But how about in the newsrooms themselves? Have we reached a point where the news editors are looking for a particular spin on the story and won't report anything that contradicts it?
Look, I think there are 2 issues involved here. One is that on the one hand, there's strong intimidation that is so successful that by and large, there's no more need for violence, but there has been serious violence, particularly back during the civil war in Lebanon. Serious, you know, reporters getting killed by various groups. So on the one hand, you have intimidation. On the other hand, a lot of these reporters won't admit that they're intimidated. Steve Erlanger was asked about intimidation. He said, absolutely not, nothing of the sort. So on the one hand, they can't admit to their audiences that there's intimidation. They can't admit to themselves that they're lying to their audiences that there's intimidation, so they become advocates. And the remarkable thing, I mean, I can understand some reporters being advocates, but the sort of overwhelming majority of them being advocates, I don't think that comes from a sort of independent ideological position so much as it's a kind of self-justification for giving into this kind of intimidation.
What do you think about the scandals of the Obama administration not only pressuring pro-Israel groups through the IRS, but also eavesdropping on the Associated Press and James Rosen, the husband of Christiane Amanpour? To what extent do you see the press now starting to crack from its long-held shibboleths?
Yeah, I couldn't say. I mean, I don't think there's. It's not my field. I don't particularly want to comment on that. But let me comment on part of the question you asked earlier, which is what's the difference between the journalists who are on the ground and the journalists, the editors. And it's interesting because you'll hear the journalists on the ground say, oh, I sent a much better report and they edited it. And there's no question there's editing going on at the beginning of the Intifada. There was an American yeshiva student who was beaten nearly to death by Palestinian rioters. And the picture was produced on the front page of the New York Times, identified as a Palestinian who was beaten by an Israeli border guard, when in fact the border guard was protecting him from the crowd. And that's done not at the source, but that's done in the editing room. I think a lot of editors have taken the position that they have to protect their people. So for instance, at one point there was an issue where I think Ken West took an AP report and instead of having militant, they put terrorist in. And the AP actually wrote them a letter saying, you can't do this. If you're going to use it, then don't give the AP byline, or maybe it was Reuters. And the point was that our people will be in danger if we use the word terrorist. So there's, you know, and I think it's reasonable for these guys to be protective, but I think that, you know, the results are disastrous for the information we get. And what you end up with is not just a sort of distortion or, you know, exaggeration, overplaying one thing, underplaying another thing. You actually get an inversion. So for instance, in Jenin, the Palestinians were reporting, you know, the summary execution of over 500 Palestinians and stuff. Nothing of the sort happened. And, you know, to this day, in many circles, Jenin is known as a massacre. When in fact the Jenin operation, probably in the annals of military history, represents one of the most extraordinary efforts and sacrifice of men on the part of the IDF not to harm Palestinian civilians.
Are these isolated incidences, or is there an incredulity of the Ma'an Palestinian news agency and all reportage that comes from Palestinian sources?
There isn't. I mean, you know, one of the things that's really quite remarkable is that the same people who are extremely critical of anything the Israelis say and by and large dismiss it as propaganda are staggeringly credulous towards the stuff that comes out from the Palestinians. No, I would say this is a pervasive pattern. And it's a really destructive pattern because it ends up blinding us. I mean, in some senses, the news media is the first draft of history. In civil society, it's our eyes and ears. You know, a modern democracy makes its decisions based on things happening in a world that it can't directly experience. So it depends on the media. And if the media is literally inverting images of reality, we're radically misinformed. And I would say that the entire history of sort of failed negotiations, I mean, everybody now agrees, not everybody, but a lot of people now agree that, you know, negotiations really didn't work. And they were based on a positive sum notion of the, you know, each side gives something, each side gets something, and so on. I would say that the sort of, John Kerry is a perfect example of the sort of cognitive disorientation that has struck Western elites, in which we project our mentality onto other people who don't share that mentality, don't share our approach to positive sum approach to solving problems. And we're constantly failing, and yet we keep trying.
Do you feel that Arab journalists can be trusted to accurately report the Arab-Israeli conflict?
No, they openly say that they're fighting the fight. I mean, you know, there are some good Arab journalists, but by and large, most of the Arab journalists are part of the problem. And Arab political culture is committed to the intimidation of reporters who report things that shouldn't happen. So that shouldn't be reported. So yeah, no, I would say that you know, the Mohammed al-Dua case is a really good one. Here's Talal Abu Rahmeh, who's staging something, and Charles Andelin, the French journalist who ran the story, said to me personally while we were watching this guy's raw footage that was full of fakes, oh yeah, well they do that all the time. Now, he'll say that privately, but publicly he'll say, oh, he's a professional journalist of the highest quality. I trust him completely. So you got this sort of public secret going on, and everybody knows but the public.
To what extent do you feel that the debut of the Al Jazeera America channel will help Americans better understand the world and the march of Islamism?
I don't think it's going to help. If anything, it's going to hurt. And by the way, I don't know if you know this, but they're setting up their Central American headquarters in the museum, which is dedicated to free journalism and democracy. Yeah, no, I mean, I think, look, some people say English Al Jazeera is really a good station, and it certainly gives us stories that we wouldn't ordinarily get from our journalists. So on that level, you know, it may be giving us stories, but the ability to understand how reliable these stories are is pretty far from the public.
How do you believe that Americans should perceive news represented through Al Jazeera America?
As I said, you know, hermeneutic of suspicion. Anything that you get from them needs to be viewed with great skepticism and double and triple checked. Most people aren't. I mean, what I would say is any time you read something in Al Jazeera, Google it and look for the critique. There are a whole bunch of, you know, The Guardian has a blog called CIF Watch. There are a whole bunch of different groups, BBC Watch and so on. So, you know, the critical stuff is available, but we have to be active viewers. We can't be passive viewers. You know, the age of, oh, I trust the media. Can we keep the noise down, please?
Where can people look for accurate depictions of Islamism?
Or critiques?
Well, not just critiques, but to get around the slants of the BBC and the Associated Press.
Oh, look, There are a number of organizations that are dedicated to following this kind of material. Steve Emerson's
Investigative project?
investigative project in counterterrorism. He just came out with a new movie that I saw that's really quite important.
The Grand Deception?
Yeah, The Grand Deception and so on. You know, Middle East Quarterly Review. You know, the material is out there. You just have to step outside of the sort of mainstream news media to look for it.
Would you encourage the public to pressure Western
absolutely.
news agencies?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that if the mainstream news media were to report accurately what's going on, a lot would change. A lot would change quite dramatically.